Most people assume that becoming a millionaire is the hard part. These people prove that keeping the money is infinitely harder, especially when you're completely determined to get rid of it in the dumbest ways humanly possible. This is a countdown of 45 millionaires who looked at their fortunes and thought, challenge accepted. 1. One man sold his construction company for $4 million after building it from nothing over 2 decades. And the moment the wire transfer cleared, he decided his true calling had always been treasure hunting. Not as a hobby, as a full-time professional career that would, in his mind, eventually make him even wealthier than construction ever had. He purchased a research vessel, professional sonar equipment, underwater drones, and hired a crew of 11 people to help him locate a shipwreck he was absolutely convinced held millions in unclaimed gold off the coast of a small Caribbean island. He had no formal training in marine archaeology, no academic backing, and no credible source pointing to the shipwreck's existence beyond a rumor he'd heard at a bar from a man he'd never met before and never saw again. He spent 3 years at sea, lost 2 drones to equipment failure, ran the vessel aground once, and paid his crew through increasingly tense monthly arguments about whether paychecks were still coming. When the money was almost entirely gone, a professional marine historian he finally consulted told him in about 15 minutes that the shipwreck he'd been searching for had been salvaged and documented in the 1960s, and the gold had been sitting in a museum in the Netherlands for 60 years. He came home with a deep tan, no treasure, and roughly $180,000 left to his name. 2. A woman who'd spent 30 years building a successful chain of dry cleaning businesses sold everything for $6 million and immediately announced to her family that she was going to become a film producer. She had never worked in entertainment, never been to a film set, and by her own admission had not watched a movie all the way through in years because she always fell asleep. None of this discouraged her. She hired a director whose entire resume consisted of 2 local television commercials, cast her relatives in every major role because she trusted family over strangers, and greenlit a script she had personally written over the course of a single weekend about a group of adventurers searching for a hidden city beneath the Sahara Desert. Filming took place in a quarry 2 hours from her house, which she felt convincingly resembled North Africa if you didn't look too carefully at the trees. The budget ballooned from $800,000 to $3.2 million as she kept adding scenes, changing costumes, and firing crew members who disagreed with her creative vision. The finished film was 4 hours and 12 minutes long, had no distributor, and screened exactly once in a rented theater to an audience of people she'd personally driven to the venue. She kept the framed poster on her wall long after she'd moved out of the house she could no longer afford and into a 2-bedroom apartment she shared with her sister. 3. A man who'd made $7 million over a career in pharmaceutical sales retired at 52 and decided, with no agricultural background whatsoever, that he was going to build the most technologically advanced farm in the country. Not a normal farm, a smart farm. A farm so thoroughly automated and digitally integrated that it would essentially run itself while generating enormous profits and revolutionizing how food was grown. He purchased 400 acres, installed sensor networks across every field, bought automated irrigation systems, climate monitoring stations, drone fleets for crop surveillance, and contracted a software company to build him a custom farm management platform from scratch. The software took 2 years to develop, cost $1.2 million, and when it was finally deployed, it was spectacularly incompatible with most of the hardware he'd already installed. The automated irrigation systems overwatered half his crops and underwatered the other half. The drones flew beautifully, but the data they collected couldn't be properly read by the software. His first harvest was so poor that he lost money on it, rather than making any. His second harvest never happened, because by then he'd run out of operating capital and had to sell the land at a loss to a neighboring farmer, who grew perfectly good crops using methods developed in the 1970s. 4. A woman who'd quietly accumulated $5 million through decades of careful property investment decided in her late 50s that she deserved to live like the wealthy people she'd always read about, and she began spending accordingly. She purchased a 12-bedroom mansion she lived in alone, hired a full household staff of 14 people, including a personal chef, 2 housekeepers, a groundskeeper, a personal assistant, a driver, and a woman whose only job was to manage the schedules of the other staff members. She redecorated the entire mansion twice in 3 years because she changed her mind about the aesthetic, hosted elaborate dinner parties for acquaintances who weren't particularly close to her, and took 4 international vacations per year in business class with her assistant in tow. She never sat down and calculated what all of this cost monthly because she genuinely believed that $5 million was so large a number that it couldn't possibly run out if she was reasonably sensible. She was not being reasonably sensible. She was spending approximately $40,000 per month on household operations alone. By the time her accountant finally forced her to sit through the numbers, she had less than $300,000 remaining and a staff of 14 people. She had no idea how to let go of because she'd never had a difficult professional conversation in her life. 5. A man who'd earned $9 million building a regional trucking empire decided to diversify by entering the horse racing industry, a world he knew absolutely nothing about but had admired from a distance for years. He purchased 6 thoroughbred racehorses, hired trainers, bought a property with stabling facilities, and began entering his horses in competitions with the supreme confidence of someone who confused enthusiasm for expertise. None of his horses were particularly fast. 2 had joint problems that his vet had flagged before purchase, but that he dismissed because he liked the way they looked. He responded to every loss not by reassessing his approach, but by buying more horses, upgrading his facilities, hiring better trainers, and entering higher stakes races where his horses lost even more expensively. He expanded his stabling operation, brought in a nutritionist, hired a sports psychologist who worked exclusively with horses, and spent $200,000 on a custom-built recovery spa for animals that wanted nothing to do with hydrotherapy. Over 6 years, he spent $7 million on horses that won him approximately $140,000 in prize money. He sold the remaining horses and the property at a significant loss and moved back to trucking, where he understood how things worked and nothing he owned ate $3,000 of food per month. 6. A woman who'd made $4 million through a successful catering company sold the business and immediately launched a luxury fragrance brand, convinced that her refined taste and years of working with fine ingredients had given her an instinct for the perfume industry. She hired a master perfumer in France, flew to Paris 4 times for consultations, designed elaborate packaging, leased retail space in 2 upscale shopping districts, and produced an initial run of 10,000 bottles of her debut scent, which she named after herself and priced at $380 per bottle. The fragrance smelled, according to every independent reviewer who evaluated it, overwhelmingly like a dentist's office. She dismissed the reviews as coming from people who didn't understand sophistication, printed new marketing materials describing the scent as clinically elegant, and doubled down on retail space. Her second fragrance, rushed to market to try to recover losses, smelled according to the same reviewers like her first fragrance, but slightly more expensive. She closed both retail locations, donated the remaining inventory to a hotel chain that used it as complimentary bathroom amenities, and spent the next several years telling people at dinner parties that the perfume industry simply wasn't ready for her vision. 7. A man who'd accumulated $11 million in commercial real estate decided to branch out into art investment after attending one gallery opening and becoming convinced he had a natural eye for identifying undervalued talent. He began purchasing paintings, sculptures, and installations from emerging artists at prices that reflected the seller's enthusiasm for finding a buyer rather than any objective market assessment. He filled an entire warehouse with art he'd acquired, turned his home into a gallery that confused and alarmed houseguests, and began attending every art fair and auction he could find, spending freely on pieces that felt important to him without consulting anyone who might have offered a second opinion. He hired a curator to manage his collection, who privately described it as aggressively eclectic. When he eventually attempted to liquidate the collection through a reputable auction house, appraisers valued the entire warehouse at roughly 12% of what he'd paid for it. Several pieces had actually decreased in value simply by being associated with a collection that serious buyers didn't respect. He sold everything he could, kept a few pieces he couldn't bring himself to part with, and returned to real estate considerably poorer and with a much more complicated relationship with abstract sculpture. 8. A woman who'd made $3 million running a chain of successful hair salons decided her real passion was aviation, and she began pursuing a private pilot's license with the same all-or-nothing energy she'd brought to every previous endeavor. Within 3 months of starting flight lessons, she purchased a single-engine aircraft before completing her license, reasoning that owning the plane would motivate her to finish training faster. She purchased a second, larger aircraft 6 months later because she felt the first one lacked ambition. She began planning a solo flight around the world before she had accumulated enough hours to fly without an instructor legally present. She hired a full-time flight coach, rented hangar space at 2 different airports, and spent $60,000 on a navigation and communication upgrade for a plane she wasn't yet qualified to fly alone. Her training stalled repeatedly because her schedule was too chaotic. Her 2 planes sat in hangars accumulating maintenance costs, and the world flight never materialized. She eventually sold both aircraft for considerably less than she'd paid, closed the salon she'd neglected during her aviation obsession, and moved in with her daughter while she figured out what came next. 9. A man who'd made $6 million in the restaurant industry decided to retire and spend his money building the most impressive private wine cellar in the country, which would have been a perfectly reasonable hobby if he'd had any genuine interest in wine before the idea occurred to him. He hired architects to design a climate-controlled underground facility beneath his home, purchased thousands of bottles based primarily on price rather than taste or investment merit, flew to wine regions in France, Italy, and Spain to buy directly from producers, and hired a sommelier to manage the collection full-time. He hosted elaborate tasting events for friends and acquaintances, most of whom were equally unqualified to evaluate what they were drinking, but were too polite to say so. He spent $2 million acquiring wine and $800,000 building and maintaining the facility. When a pipe burst in his home 3 years into the project and the resulting water damage destroyed a significant portion of the collection, his insurance company pointed out several clauses in his policy that he hadn't read carefully, and the payout covered approximately a third of his losses. He sold the remaining bottles through an auction house, cleared enough to cover some of his debts, and came to terms with the fact that he'd built a $2.8 million monument to a hobby he'd invented for himself. 10. A woman who'd built $8 million through a successful chain of fitness studios decided to invest in the restaurant industry, which she'd always viewed romantically from the outside without ever working in it or studying it seriously. She opened 3 restaurants simultaneously in the same city, each with a different concept, each requiring its own full staff, kitchen setup, marketing campaign, and management structure. She hired chefs based on charisma rather than track record, designed menus that sounded exciting but were operationally difficult to execute consistently, and priced her restaurants at premium levels in neighborhoods where customers expected premium food that her kitchens weren't consistently delivering. She spent lavishly on interior design, hosted grand opening events that generated excellent initial buzz, and then watched as repeat business failed to materialize at the rate she'd projected. 2 restaurants closed within 18 months. The third survived another year before the accumulated losses made continuing impossible. She later reflected that every restaurateur she'd spoken to before opening had warned her not to open 3 locations at once, and she had interpreted their caution as a lack of vision rather than hard-won experience. 11. A man who'd made $12 million in software development decided to pour his fortune into building a private sports complex in his hometown, convinced that his community needed a world-class athletic facility and that he was the man to provide it. He purchased land, hired architects, contracted builders, and designed a complex featuring an Olympic-sized swimming pool, 6 tennis courts, 2 basketball arenas, a running track, and a spa facility. Construction costs exceeded initial estimates by 60% due to complications he hadn't anticipated, and a contractor who was significantly better at collecting payments than completing work on schedule. When the complex finally opened, he discovered that running a sports facility was an entirely different business from building one, requiring operational expertise, marketing, staffing, maintenance budgets, and membership sales infrastructure that he'd given almost no thought to. Membership numbers never reached the levels needed to cover operating costs. He hired and fired 3 different management companies in 2 years, each one inheriting a facility with growing maintenance backlogs and declining membership numbers. He sold the complex to a regional gym chain for less than the cost of construction alone. 12. A woman who'd accumulated $5 million through years of work in pharmaceutical distribution decided her true passion was fashion, and she launched a luxury clothing line targeting wealthy women who, she was certain, were desperate for exactly what she was about to create. She hired a designer, leased studio and showroom space, flew to textile manufacturers in Italy, produced a debut collection of 27 pieces, and staged a launch event at a hotel ballroom that cost more than most people's annual salaries to organize. Reviews from the fashion press who attended described the collection as ambitious, which in fashion press language meant something considerably less complimentary. Department stores she approached about carrying the line declined politely. She opened a standalone boutique to sell directly to customers, hired staff to run it, produced a second collection to follow the first, and spent heavily on advertising in magazines that her target customer actually read. The boutique generated enough sales to pay its rent in good months and not enough in most months. She closed it after 2 years, having spent $3.4 million producing and marketing clothes that never found a significant audience. 13. A man who'd made $10 million in logistics decided to invest heavily in a chain of luxury car washes, which he'd been told by someone at a golf course were a cash-generating business with almost no downside. He opened 5 locations across 3 cities, each built to a premium specification with attendance, premium products, and pricing that reflected the upscale experience he was trying to deliver. What he hadn't fully accounted for was the operational complexity of managing 5 locations across different cities, the significant equipment maintenance costs that came with high-volume car wash machinery, the staffing turnover that plagued every location, and the reality that many car owners in his target demographic simply didn't get their cars washed as frequently as his projections assumed. 2 locations were in areas with too much competition. One was in a location with a water restriction ordinance that limited operating hours. He spent 4 years trying to make the numbers work through management changes, rebranding exercises, and loyalty programs that nobody used, before selling all 5 locations to a regional operator for roughly half of what he'd invested building them. 14. A woman who'd made $7 million selling a software company decided she wanted to dedicate her next chapter to wellness and opened a network of high-end day spas, a business she entered with enormous enthusiasm and almost no operational knowledge. She leased premium retail spaces in 4 different cities, hired spa directors, trained therapists, imported equipment from Europe, and created a brand identity so polished and expensive that the marketing alone consumed $400,000 before a single treatment was sold. Her spas were genuinely beautiful. They were also genuinely expensive to operate, with rent, staffing, insurance, product costs, and equipment maintenance creating a monthly overhead that required near-constant high occupancy to break even. Spa customers, she discovered, were loyal to individual therapists rather than brands, meaning that when a good therapist left, which happened regularly because competitors offered better pay, the clients left with them. She cycled through management teams, tried different service menus, introduced membership programs, and eventually closed 2 locations to focus resources on the remaining 2, which were also losing money, just more slowly. 15. A man who'd accumulated $14 million through commercial property development decided that his decades of construction experience qualified him to build and launch a private marina and yacht club, a project he undertook with the confidence of someone who understood buildings but had never operated a marine business in his life. He purchased waterfront land, built docking facilities for 60 vessels, constructed a clubhouse with a restaurant and bar, hired a harbor master and a full hospitality team, and priced memberships at a level that reflected what he felt the experience was worth rather than what the local market would support. The restaurant lost money because it couldn't attract enough non-member diners. The membership drive stalled at 31 members, well below the 60 needed for financial viability. The marine equipment required specialized maintenance that cost significantly more than he'd budgeted. Docking fees from transient vessels provided some revenue but nothing close to projections. He operated the marina at a loss for 3 years, convinced that awareness was the problem and that enough advertising would fill the remaining slips. It did not. He sold the facility to a developer who converted it into residential waterfront properties. 16. A woman who'd made $4 million running a successful accounting practice decided to invest her savings in a vineyard, seduced by the romantic image of wine country living and the idea of building something with her hands after years of working with numbers. She purchased 40 acres in a wine-producing region, hired a viticulturist, planted vines, built a tasting room, and began developing a brand identity before her first grapes had matured. What she hadn't fully internalized was that grapes take years to produce commercially viable fruit, that running a tasting room was an entirely separate hospitality business, requiring its own skills and staffing, and that the wine market was extraordinarily competitive with thousands of established producers already fighting for shelf space and customer attention. Her first several vintages were modest in quality, as early vintages from new vineyards typically are. Her tasting room struggled to attract visitors because she was in a less trafficked part of the wine region. She invested in a winemaker with a stronger reputation, renovated the tasting room, and hired a marketing firm, none of which moved the needle enough. She sold the vineyard after 7 years, having spent far more than she'd made, and considerably more than she'd planned. 17. A man who'd made $9 million in the insurance industry retired and almost immediately decided to invest in professional boxing, convinced that he had an eye for talent and that the fight promotion business was essentially just sales and networking dressed up in boxing gloves. He signed 3 fighters he was certain had championship potential, hired trainers, rented gym space, paid for training camps, and began promoting fights at regional venues. Promoting boxing, he discovered, required navigating a deeply political industry with established relationships, sanctioning body fees, television network connections, and promotional hierarchies that had no interest in making room for a well-funded newcomer with no track record. His fighters were skilled but not exceptional. The events he promoted lost money because building an audience for fighters nobody had heard of required marketing investments that dwarfed ticket revenue. He persisted for 4 years because he'd publicly committed to the vision and found it difficult to admit the business wasn't working, spending $5 million before accepting that being enthusiastic about boxing was not the same as being qualified to run a boxing promotion. 18. A woman who'd built $6 million through years in property management decided to pour it into building a chain of boutique hotels, which she felt was a natural extension of her experience managing buildings and people. She purchased 3 properties in tourist destinations, renovated them extensively to the standard of small luxury hotels, hired hospitality staff, and launched all 3 within an 18-month window, which gave her almost no opportunity to learn from the first before committing fully to the second and third. Boutique hotel operation, she discovered, was significantly more complex than property management, requiring sophisticated revenue management, online distribution strategies, guest experience design, and the kind of reputation building that took years to develop. Her hotels received decent reviews but struggled with occupancy rates that fell well below what she needed. She hired and replaced management teams, invested in marketing campaigns, and introduced package deals that attracted guests at margins too thin to cover operational costs. She sold 2 of the 3 properties after 4 years, kept the third as a long-term rental building, and quietly returned to the property management work she'd been good at. 19. A man who'd made $5 million in wholesale food distribution decided to build a luxury private members club that would serve as a social hub for wealthy professionals in his city. He leased a large building in a prime location, spent $2 million on interior design and renovations, hired a general manager with hospitality experience, recruited a chef for the in-house restaurant, and launched a membership drive targeting the city's business community. The concept was sound, but the execution revealed gaps. Membership sales were slower than projected because establishing social credibility for a new club took longer than spending money on it. The restaurant required operating regardless of how many members showed up on any given day. Monthly overhead was substantial, and the revenue from membership fees, even as numbers grew, didn't cover it. He subsidized the club's losses from his savings for 3 years because he'd told too many people about it to let it fail quietly. When he finally closed it, the building lease still had 2 years remaining, and he was required to pay out the remainder regardless. 20. A woman who'd accumulated $8 million through a career in pharmaceuticals decided to launch a private school based on an educational philosophy she'd developed herself, which she was convinced would revolutionize how children learned. She leased a large building, hired teachers and administrators, developed a curriculum that combined elements from various educational theories she'd read about, and opened the school with an inaugural class of 30 students whose parents were excited by her vision and persuasive sales pitch. The educational philosophy, as experienced by actual children in actual classrooms, produced mixed results. Regulatory requirements for private schools turned out to be far more extensive than she'd anticipated. Several teachers left after the first semester because the curriculum was difficult to deliver consistently. Parents began raising concerns about academic standards and the school's ability to prepare students for standardized testing. She hired curriculum consultants, brought in an experienced school administrator, and revised the educational approach twice in 2 years, each revision requiring new materials and additional training. The school never achieved financial sustainability and closed at the end of its 3rd year. 21. A man who'd made $11 million in the energy sector decided to fund a theatrical production company, convinced that he had cultural ambitions that deserved expression and that the theater industry was waiting for someone with his vision and resources to shake it up. He leased a theater space, hired a creative director, commissioned original productions, and began staging shows that reflected his personal taste rather than what audiences were likely to pay to see. His productions were ambitious, experimental, and consistently attended by small, polite audiences who were largely friends, colleagues, and people who'd received complimentary tickets. The shows received mixed reviews. He increased the marketing budget, brought in bigger-name directors, and produced a musical that cost $900,000 and ran for 11 performances before closing due to poor ticket sales. He kept the theater running for 4 years because he'd developed a genuine love for the work, even as it was consuming his fortune, and by the time he finally closed it, he'd spent $6 million producing theater that had given him a sense of purpose but had not come close to recouping his investment. 22. A woman who'd made $4 million in retail decided to launch a high-end food delivery service specializing in gourmet meals prepared by restaurant-quality chefs and delivered to customers' homes in temperature-controlled containers with the kind of presentation normally reserved for fine dining. She hired talented chefs, invested in custom packaging, built a commissary kitchen, and launched in one affluent neighborhood with plans to expand citywide. The concept attracted enthusiastic early customers, but the economics were brutal. Gourmet food preparation at volume required more labor than she'd budgeted. Delivery logistics in a city were expensive and complicated. Customers who loved the food balked at the prices required to make the business work, and customers willing to pay the prices didn't order frequently enough to sustain the operation. She expanded too quickly to a second neighborhood before the first was profitable, doubling her overhead before proving the model. She contracted the business back to its original footprint, switched chefs, revised the menu, and tried 3 different pricing structures before accepting that the model didn't work at any price she could charge. 23. A man who'd accumulated $15 million in construction decided to get into the cruise industry, which he'd always loved as a passenger and was certain he could improve as an operator. He purchased a mid-sized vessel, had it refitted to his specifications at a cost that significantly exceeded initial estimates, because marine refits always do, hired a crew, obtained necessary certifications, and launched a boutique cruise line offering itineraries in the Mediterranean. Operating a cruise ship, he discovered, bore almost no resemblance to enjoying one. The regulatory environment was enormously complex. Crew management at sea was unlike any workforce management he'd encountered. Port fees, fuel costs, provisioning, insurance, and maintenance created an operational expense structure that required very high occupancy to sustain. His boutique positioning attracted customers, but not enough of them consistently enough to cover costs. He operated 2 seasons before the losses became impossible to rationalize and sold the vessel, taking a significant loss on the refit cost he'd never recovered. 24. A woman who'd made $7 million building a successful recruitment firm decided to invest in a technology company developing software for the human resources industry, an area she knew well from her business career. She invested $3 million as the lead investor, joined the board, and watched over the following 2 years as the company burned through cash. Developing a product that repeatedly missed launch deadlines, shifted its target customer 3 times, and cycled through 2 CEOs and 1 complete technical rebuild. She invested an additional $1.5 million in a follow-on round, because by that point she'd already committed so much that stopping felt like an even larger loss. The company eventually launched a product that received positive feedback from a small number of users, but failed to achieve the growth rate needed to attract further investment. It shut down, and she received a modest payment from the asset liquidation that covered approximately 8% of what she'd put in. 25. A man who'd made $6 million in commercial photography decided to build a luxury camping resort that would offer wealthy guests an authentic outdoor experience with premium amenities, a concept he'd read about and become convinced was a major gap in the market. He purchased remote land, built individual cabin structures, installed high-end outdoor kitchens, hired guides and hospitality staff, and created an experience that genuinely was beautiful and well-designed. What he hadn't adequately researched was whether wealthy guests would travel to his specific location, which was remote enough to feel authentic, but not conveniently located relative to any major population center. Occupancy was never consistent. Marketing to affluent travelers was expensive. The operating season was limited by weather. He invested in a helicopter transfer service to make arrival easier, which added significant cost and operational complexity. He tried corporate retreat packages, wedding packages, and private event bookings to fill gaps between leisure bookings. None of it produced the occupancy he needed, and after 5 years he sold the property to a conservation organization that converted it to a nature preserve. 26. A woman who'd accumulated $9 million through commercial real estate decided to launch a luxury cosmetics line after becoming frustrated with the products available on the market and concluding that she could do better. She hired a cosmetic chemist, developed a range of skincare and makeup products, created premium packaging, and approached department stores about carrying the line. Department stores were politely uninterested in an unknown brand with no marketing history. She opened her own retail locations, hired beauty consultants, and invested in advertising campaigns and publications that reached her target consumer. The products were genuinely good quality, but the cosmetics industry is extraordinarily competitive, dominated by brands with decades of customer loyalty and marketing budgets she couldn't approach. Her retail locations generated sales that didn't cover their costs. Online sales were modest. She tried a subscription model, a salon partnership program, and a celebrity endorsement that cost $400,000 and produced a short spike in interest followed by a return to previous sales levels. She closed the retail locations, sold remaining inventory at a loss, and licensed the formulations to a larger company for a fraction of what she'd spent developing them. 27. A man who'd made $13 million selling a regional supermarket chain decided to invest in professional soccer, purchasing a lower division club with ambitions of climbing through the leagues to the top flight. A journey he'd been told would take 5 to 7 years with adequate investment. He invested heavily in players, hired coaches with strong track records, upgraded the club's training facilities, and launched a commercial operation to grow revenue through sponsorship and merchandise. The club improved, but not at the pace required to justify his investment. Promotion to the next division cost more than expected. Player wages in the higher division were significantly greater than he'd budgeted. The commercial revenue he'd projected took much longer to materialize than he'd hoped, because building a supporter base was a generational process rather than a marketing campaign. He spent $9 million over 7 years, achieved 1 promotion, and sold the club when he recognized that reaching the top flight would require an investment he couldn't sustain. 28. A woman who'd made $5 million through a career in corporate law decided to open a chain of luxury children's party venues, convinced there was a gap in the market for premium, beautifully designed spaces where wealthy parents could host unforgettable celebrations for their children. She leased large premises in affluent neighborhoods in 2 cities, invested heavily in interior design, hired entertainment coordinators and party planners, and launched with a menu of packages priced to reflect the quality of the experience. The venues were stunning. The parties were genuinely impressive. The problem was that even wealthy parents hosted birthday parties infrequently, meaning each venue needed to book a very high number of events per month to cover its costs. And the market for premium children's parties in any given neighborhood wasn't deep enough to sustain that volume. She tried corporate event bookings, private adult parties, and photography rental packages to fill gaps in the calendar. Nothing created consistent enough revenue, and she closed both venues after 2 years with significant losses on both the design investment and the remaining lease obligations. 29. A man who'd accumulated $10 million through years in financial consulting decided to launch a private aviation company offering charter flights in a region he felt was underserved. He purchased 2 aircraft, hired pilots and ground crew, obtained the necessary operating licenses, and launched with an aggressive pricing strategy designed to build market share quickly. Charter aviation, he discovered from the inside, was operationally demanding in ways that were difficult to appreciate from the outside. Aircraft maintenance was expensive and unscheduled. Maintenance was unpredictable. Pilots were difficult to recruit and expensive to retain. Utilization rates for his aircraft never reached the levels his business plan required because building a charter customer base took longer than he'd anticipated. He added a 3rd aircraft to offer more flexibility, which increased costs without proportionally increasing revenue. He tried positioning the service differently, partnering with travel agencies and targeting corporate clients, all while burning through reserves faster than he was building revenue. He sold the aircraft and operating licenses after 3 years at a loss that consumed most of what he'd invested. 30. A woman who'd made $6 million in pharmaceutical sales decided to invest in a high-end dog boarding and training facility that would offer pet owners something genuinely different from conventional kennels. She purchased property outside the city, built spacious individual suites for dogs, hired professional trainers with strong credentials, installed surveillance cameras so owners could check on their pets remotely, and created a premium service that genuinely delivered on its promises. The facility filled up, received excellent reviews, and developed a loyal customer base. Then she began expanding. She purchased additional properties, opened 3 more locations, hired more staff, and scaled the operation faster than her management infrastructure could support. Quality control across multiple locations was harder than managing one. Staff at locations she couldn't personally oversee were less consistently excellent. Bad reviews appeared. Customer complaints increased. The expansion had created overhead that her original location's profitability couldn't subsidize, and the new locations weren't achieving the same margins. She contracted back to 2 locations and then 1, selling the others at losses, and ended up with a smaller business than she'd started with and considerably less money. 31. A man who'd made $8 million in wholesale distribution decided to build a private golf club on land he owned, driven by his love of the game and his frustration with the waitlist at established clubs in his area. He hired a golf course architect, cleared and shaped the land, built a clubhouse, greens, fairways, a driving range, and practice facilities that met the standards he expected from the clubs he admired. Construction cost $4 million, which was at the higher end of his budget. Operating the club required staff, maintenance equipment, groundskeeping teams, a pro shop, a restaurant, and an event operation, all of which created monthly costs that required a significant membership base to support. Recruiting members was slower than he expected, because new clubs without history and reputation attract members more slowly than established ones. He hosted tournaments and charity events to create visibility and offered introductory membership rates that helped with recruitment, but hurt his per-member revenue. After 5 years, he had a beautiful golf club that was losing money, and a growing realization that he'd built something that would require either a very long runway or a very different financial approach to reach sustainability. 32. A woman who'd accumulated $7 million through a career in architecture decided to launch a furniture design and manufacturing company, convinced that her design background gave her both the creative foundation and the professional credibility to succeed in the luxury furniture market. She hired craftspeople, leased workshop space, developed a debut collection, and staged a launch at a design fair that attracted genuine interest from interior designers and retailers. Orders came in at encouraging levels. The problem was production. Handcrafted luxury furniture took time to make, and her workshop couldn't produce at the rate orders required without quality declining. She invested in more craftspeople and expanded the workspace, which increased overhead. Lead times stretched, which frustrated retailers and caused some to cancel orders. She tried standardizing parts of the production process, which compromised the handcrafted positioning. She tried outsourcing components, which introduced quality inconsistencies. The company generated revenue, but never enough to cover the cost of the workshop, payroll, and the debt she'd taken on to fund expansion. 33. A man who'd made $12 million in insurance decided to invest in a chain of language learning centers, offering immersive instruction in major languages to adult professionals, a concept he'd experienced personally as a customer, and had left believing he could run better. He leased premises in 3 cities, hired native-speaking instructors, developed a proprietary curriculum, and launched with premium pricing and a marketing campaign targeting corporate clients. Corporate clients, he discovered, were enthusiastic about language training in principle, but difficult to convert into paying customers because internal procurement processes were slow and training budget approval cycles were long. Individual adult learners were a more accessible market but more price-sensitive than he'd planned for. His 3 locations had significant fixed costs and the revenue ramp was much slower than projected. He reduced pricing to drive enrollment, which helped volume but hurt margins. He tried corporate partnership programs, online course supplements, and immersive weekend intensives. The business was always almost working, which made it difficult to stop, and after 4 years he closed all 3 locations. 34. A woman who'd built $5 million through a successful events catering business decided to invest in a boutique gin distillery, seduced by the artisan spirits boom she'd observed and convinced that her palate and creativity gave her an edge in developing something genuinely distinctive. She purchased distilling equipment, leased a production space, hired a distiller with a strong track record, and spent considerable time and money developing a range of gins she was genuinely proud of. Getting them to market was a different challenge entirely. Spirits distribution required relationships with distributors who were already carrying multiple competing products and had little incentive to prioritize a new brand. She launched her own direct-to-consumer sales through a tasting room attached to the distillery, which generated revenue but not at the volume needed. She hired a sales team to pursue bar and restaurant accounts, which produced gradual progress but required continued investment in samples, events, and relationship development. The distillery produced excellent gin that sat largely in storage because distribution remained the bottleneck the entire time she operated it. 35. A man who'd made $9 million in commercial construction decided to build a private medical clinic offering concierge health services to wealthy clients who wanted premium access and personalized attention beyond what the standard healthcare system provided. He leased a premium location, fitted it to medical standards at significant cost, recruited physicians and specialists, and launched with a membership model offering clients comprehensive care, same-day appointments, and direct physician access. The concept attracted members, but recruiting and retaining high-quality physicians proved expensive because the doctors worth having had options. Medical malpractice insurance was substantially higher than he'd anticipated. Regulatory compliance in healthcare was more complex and costly than in construction. Members expected a level of service that required a staff-to-patient ratio that was difficult to sustain financially. He expanded the service offering to attract more members, which increased operational complexity and overhead. After 3 years, he had more members than he'd launched with, more costs than he'd budgeted for, and a business that was breaking even in good months and losing money in bad ones, which was most of them. 36. A woman who'd accumulated $6 million through retail property investment decided to launch a premium meal kit delivery company at a time when the category was competitive and several well-funded national players were already fighting for market share. She developed distinctive recipes, sourced premium ingredients from local farms and producers, built a production kitchen, hired culinary staff, and launched with marketing that emphasized the quality gap between her product and the national brands. Her meals were genuinely superior. They were also genuinely more expensive to produce, and pricing them at levels that covered her costs put her above what most meal kit customers were willing to pay. She tried lower margin pricing to grow subscribers, which built the customer base but created a financial model that didn't work at any volume she could realistically reach. She tried a premium restaurant-at-home positioning with higher pricing, which attracted fewer subscribers but better margins. She could never find a price point that was simultaneously affordable enough to attract customers and high enough to cover costs. 37. A man who'd made $10 million in real estate development decided to invest in a chain of luxury barber shops, convinced that men's grooming was an underserved premium market and that he could create a brand that would scale nationally. He opened 3 locations, invested heavily in interior design, hired master barbers, and priced his services at a significant premium to standard barbershops. The shops were beautiful, the barbers were talented, and the reviews were strong. But premium barbershops, he discovered, were deeply personal businesses where clients were loyal to individual barbers rather than to the brand. When his best barbers left, which happened regularly because talented barbers had options, clients followed them out the door. He invested in barber training programs to build loyalty and proprietary technique, which slowed turnover but didn't stop it. The economics of premium barbering, where each appointment generated a fixed revenue regardless of how attractive the space was, made it difficult to cover the overhead of 3 beautifully designed locations. 38. A woman who'd made $7 million selling a food manufacturing company decided to invest in premium pet food, developing a brand of human-grade, nutritionist-formulated food for dogs and cats that she intended to position as the premium alternative in a market she'd noticed becoming increasingly sophisticated. She developed formulations with genuine nutritional credentials, created packaging that stood out on shelves, and approached pet retail chains about distribution. Pet retail chains carried extensive product ranges and had little reason to clear shelf space for an unproven brand. She invested in online direct-to-consumer sales with strong early results, built a subscriber base, and hired a team to pursue independent pet store distribution. Getting from direct-to-consumer success to retail distribution proved expensive and slow, requiring investment in sales infrastructure, trade marketing, and promotional activity. She had a genuine product but couldn't scale distribution without investment that outpaced her revenue, and the investors she approached wanted growth metrics she couldn't yet show them. 39. A man who'd accumulated $8 million through a career in corporate banking decided to leave finance entirely and build a luxury fishing lodge in a remote northern location that he'd visited once and described to his wife as the most beautiful place he'd ever seen. He purchased land, contracted a builder, installed the main lodge and 6 guest cabins, hired a team of fishing guides, and launched a premium angling experience for high-end clients willing to pay significant daily rates for access to exceptional fishing. The lodge was genuinely spectacular, and the fishing was outstanding. The problem was logistics. The remote location that made it extraordinary made it expensive and complicated to operate. Food, fuel, and supplies required regular air transport. Staff turnover was high because working remotely for extended periods wasn't for everyone. The operating season was limited by weather to roughly 5 months per year, meaning 5 months of revenue had to cover 12 months of cost. He charged premium rates that attracted serious anglers and covered operating expenses during peak season, but left no margin for the capital investments and maintenance the property constantly required. 40. A woman who'd made $5 million in financial planning decided to build a destination yoga and wellness retreat in a location she'd chosen for its natural beauty rather than its accessibility. She purchased land, built accommodation for 30 guests, hired yoga teachers and wellness practitioners, developed programs ranging from weekend retreats to month-long residencies, and launched with a marketing campaign targeting high-income wellness enthusiasts. The retreat received enthusiastic responses from its first guests and generated strong word of mouth. Scaling from occasional full capacity to consistent bookings throughout the year proved much harder than she'd anticipated. The travel involved in reaching her beautiful but remote location deterred repeat visitors. Her programs were seasonal, attracting guests in certain months and struggling in others. She invested in new programming, brought in high-profile teachers to create events that would justify the journey, and hired a hospitality director to improve the guest experience. The retreat was regularly full when it worked and empty when it didn't, and the average occupancy across the year was never enough. 41. A man who'd made $14 million selling a regional newspaper group decided to launch a premium private members club focused on intellectual and cultural life, offering members access to lectures, debates, exclusive dinners with prominent figures, and a beautifully designed space for working and socializing. He leased a large townhouse in a prestigious part of the city, invested $1.8 million in renovation and interior design, hired a program director to curate the intellectual calendar, and launched a membership drive targeting academics, business leaders, artists, and professionals who he felt were underserved by the existing social club landscape. The events were excellent. The space was widely admired. Membership grew but more slowly than his financial model required, because the kind of intellectually serious people he was targeting tended to be skeptical of exclusive clubs and needed to be convinced through experience rather than marketing. Monthly operating costs were high, and the membership fees, even as numbers grew, didn't cover them. He subsidized the deficit from his personal savings for 3 years because he loved what he'd built and couldn't bring himself to close it. 42. A woman who'd accumulated $9 million through commercial interior design decided to launch a luxury housewares brand, convinced that her design expertise and industry relationships gave her an advantage in developing products that genuinely competed at the premium end of the market. She developed a range of home goods, found manufacturers in Europe, created a brand identity, and launched at a major housewares trade fair where the reception was enthusiastic. Retail buyers from department stores placed orders. She scaled up production to meet initial orders, invested in a showroom, hired a sales team, and prepared for what she expected to be a strong first year. The retail orders were strong, but payment terms in the industry were long, meaning cash she'd spent producing goods sat in retail inventory for months before she was paid. Returns and markdown allowances from department stores were more extensive than she'd anticipated. Her margins, which had looked reasonable in the business plan, were tighter in practice because production costs ran higher than expected. She was always in a cash flow position that looked better on paper than it felt in reality. And after 3 years of growth that wasn't translating to profit, she sold the brand. 43. A man who'd made $11 million in wholesale food distribution decided to invest in a premium chocolate company, inspired by a trip to Belgium and a genuine passion for fine chocolate that he was convinced could become a successful business. He hired a master chocolatier from Europe, leased production space, invested in equipment, developed a range of products, and launched a brand built around genuine craft credentials. The chocolate was exceptional. The brand was beautifully designed. The premium chocolate market was crowded with well-established players who'd spent decades building reputations, and convincing retailers and consumers to pay premium prices for an unknown name was a slow and expensive process. He hired a sales team, invested in food fair participation, pursued hotel and restaurant accounts, and launched a direct-to-consumer mail order business. Each channel generated revenue, but none of them generated enough. He expanded the product range, tried corporate gifting programs, and opened a retail shop. The retail shop was charming and popular and lost money, because high-rent chocolate retail is a difficult business at any quality level. 44. A woman who'd made $6 million in property development decided to purchase and operate a traditional country inn she'd stayed at once and fallen in love with, convinced she could improve it while preserving its character. She bought the inn, made what she intended to be careful renovations that escalated in scope when she discovered the building needed more work than the survey had indicated, hired a kitchen team, and relaunched with higher pricing and an emphasis on food quality. The food was genuinely excellent, the rooms were beautifully done, and the reviews were strong. The inn operated at capacity on weekends and holidays, and struggled to fill rooms on weekdays, which is the fundamental challenge of rural hospitality. She invested in a cooking school to generate weekday revenue, hired a more prominent chef to elevate the restaurant's reputation and attract food-focused guests, and developed corporate retreat packages. Each investment improved the product and increased costs. The inn was beloved by its guests and financially painful for its owner, a combination that sustained itself for 4 years before she sold it, considerably poorer and considerably more knowledgeable about the hospitality industry than when she'd entered it. 45. And finally, there is the story of a man who made $20 million selling his technology company and spent the first year after the sale hiring a team of advisors. Financial advisors, life advisors, career advisors, wellness advisors, and an advisor whose job was to coordinate the other advisors, to help him figure out what to do with the rest of his life. His team of advisors recommended investments, lifestyle changes, philanthropic strategies, and business opportunities, each with enormous confidence and substantial fees. He followed their recommendations comprehensively, investing in opportunities they identified, funding projects they endorsed, and building a lifestyle infrastructure they designed, all of which cost enormous amounts of money and none of which he'd independently evaluated or understood. He trusted the advisors because he was paying them, and because the alternative was making his own decisions about things he didn't yet understand. The advisors did not all agree with each other. Several were pursuing their own financial interests through his investments without adequately disclosing the conflicts. The investment returns were poor. The projects failed. The lifestyle was expensive and ultimately unsatisfying. By the time he sat down to look clearly at his financial situation without a team of people filtering the information, he had lost $14 million in 6 years and had very little to show for it beyond a comprehensive education in how much it costs to outsource your own judgment to people whose interests aren't the same as yours. Here's what connects every single one of these stories: not incompetence and not bad luck. What connects them is the belief that having money is the same as understanding how to use it. That wealth in one area of life transfers automatically to every other area. That confidence built on success in one field is a reliable guide in fields where you have no experience at all. Every one of these people earned their money through genuine skill, real work, and hard-won expertise. Then they left that expertise behind and wandered into worlds they didn't understand, led by nothing more than enthusiasm, confidence, and enough zeros in their bank accounts to make the first few mistakes feel manageable. The fortune was never the problem. The assumption that the fortune came with a manual, that was the problem. Subscribe if you want to keep your money longer than these millionaires kept theirs.